Hey everybody, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor from Water and Waste Digest. Today I have with me Ken Sansone. He is a partner at SL Environmental, and we're going to be talking about PFAS and PFAS contamination and what that means for the water industry and at large. So Ken, thank you so much for being on the call. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Of course, it's my pleasure, Bob, and thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So obviously in the water industry, PFAS has been a big topic for a couple years now. We're very aware of the prevalence of PFAS in the environment. Um, from a legislative side, what has been done to address companies that are contributing to that pollution? I know that this dates back many, many years when you look at things like the Devil We Know documentary on Netflix about how long this has been going on.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting and I think ultimately illuminating question because as the devil we know and dark waters and the media attention that PFAS contamination has received would indicate there's a pretty long and well established history of awareness of the environmental risks and the human health risks of PFAS on behalf of the responsible manufacturers. So you would think, as you suggest, that legislatures would be empowered to do something about that, to essentially order these companies to clean up the mess that they made so that taxpayers or ratepayers of utilities are not the ones stuck footing the bill. Unfortunately, that's not really the system of justice that we have in this country. And those kinds of claims for compensation are largely left to the courts. And that's where we're seeing that process play out. My firm and other firms are handling literally hundreds of cases now on behalf of water utilities and other people who have been injured by the contamination of groundwater supplies and other natural resources with PFAS. What legislatures have tried to do is at least in some states to make it easier to bring those kinds of claims. In a few states, New Hampshire is one example right now. For example, there's an effort to extend the statute of limitation for these kinds of claims because, of course, statute of limitations can be a major obstacle to trying to pursue recovery. Of course, sometimes these time limits would start running even before people became aware that their supplies were contaminated. And what we've seen on the federal level is, of course, a major source of PFAS contamination is the use of firefighting foam. And that was very heavily used at military installations, among other kinds of facilities. And so we've seen some sort of one-off pieces of legislation that have provided funds for cleaning up PFAS contamination that resulted from firefighting foam use at particular military installations in Colorado and Massachusetts. But that has yet to be implemented on a large scale across the country. So the bottom line is that utilities and other drinking water suppliers are really left to their own devices when it comes to getting the corporations to pay to clean up this mess.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, I know that right now there's a lot of things going on in terms of trying to create a framework for regulation of this for like water utilities and stuff like that you were mentioning. What are some of the things that are being that where do things stand, I guess, on determining levels in drinking water and wastewater, kind of from that regulatory perspective?
Yes. So this is a matter that is being treated with a serious sense of urgency, and part of that is the public awareness, as we've already talked about, over PFAS and how dangerous it is and how widespread it is. So there are about a dozen states or territories so far that have already implemented drinking water standards for PFAS, and of course, when we're talking about PFAS, we could be talking about literally thousands of different compounds, which is another aspect of this that makes it incredibly challenging to regulate and to deal with. But PFOA and PFOS are the most commonly found of PFAS compounds so far, also the most commonly regulated. So those, in addition to some of the other PFAS compounds that were the subject of testing under UCMR 3 a few years ago, have been the subject of drinking water regulations that are already in place in, like I said, about 10 or 12 states or territories so far. In addition, there are regulatory efforts underway in about another dozen states. About half of those are in the form of a regulation which is undergoing a rulemaking process right now, and the other half of those or so are in the form of some legislative action, which of course is another way to approach this, to simply have the legislature dictate what the appropriate standard is for these contaminants in drinking water. What I think almost all of these efforts have in common, despite their disparate sources, is low levels. And what we've seen in states that have regulated PFOA and PFOS in drinking water so far are levels that are, in the low teens measured in parts per trillion, sometimes even lower than that. New York, for example, has PFOA and PFOS levels set at 10 parts per trillion. And then, of course, in California, although there aren't drinking water standards in place yet, the precursors to those standards in California, which there are known as response and notification levels, have been set for PFOA and PFOS. Again, extraordinarily low levels in the single digits parts per trillion for both PFOA and PFOS. So that creates a very challenging picture for people who operate water utilities or try to provide drinking water. It is very challenging to treat water to those kinds of exacting standards of low parts per trillion, of course.
Yeah, that was something that I wanted to bring up too, is that while we do have like these UCMR rules, and whatnot, there is like that local and state level legislation and regulation that creates another like complexity on top of that. Because you talk about how complex this gets when you start piling like all these different levels from local to state to federal on top of each other. How does that complexity work in terms of like the work that you're doing, and how does that complexity impact utilities trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing?
Well, it plays out in a number of different ways, and of course, the EPA, a couple of years ago, um, set not an enforceable level, but a guideline at 70 parts per trillion for combined PFOA and PFOS. So, some small number of states took their cue from that, but what we've seen across the country, as I just outlined, is different regulations at different levels for different continents. So for any local utilities that operate in a number of different jurisdictions, that presents a challenge to figure out how to test for and engineer solutions for different drinking water standards, for sure. And then, of course, there's the I think distinct possibility, and EPA recently came out with some guidance suggesting that this is the direction that they're heading, that there will be a federal regulation as well. And the way that's played out, a specific example that I can give is, for example, when there's a military base that has caused some contamination from the firefighting foam, the government has taken the position pretty consistently, well, we will pay to have that cleaned up to the EPA 70 parts per trillion standard. But of course, the affected utilities say, well, if we're in California, we're dealing with a response level that is much lower than that. So where do we get that additional funding for that cleanup? That becomes a real challenge. And then you mentioned local regulation. I think for wastewater providers, that is a particular concern. Again, the EPA has announced that it's starting to look into some permitting requirements for the discharge of PFAS and wastewater. But of course, there are permits given on the state or even the county level for wastewater discharge, and they may start to incorporate standards for PFAS as well. For example, in California, the Division of Drinking Water has ordered that all wastewater treatment plants in the state be tested for PFAS. So that's widely seen as the precursor to some sort of regulation of wastewater effluent.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to touch on too, that you kind of alluded to it with the utilities working across multiple districts or across multiple boundaries. When I think about that also from the OEM perspective of providing the technologies and solutions, is like, do you stick with the lowest possible parts per trillion level, or do you try and customize it for everybody? Because at some point that customization is going to get so out of hand and it can't possibly be optimal anymore.
That's right. And which compounds are treated and to what levels have enormous impacts on the appropriateness of certain treatment technologies. Mostly what we've seen so far for PFAS is either GAC or anion exchange. Either can be
Hmm.
effective, but that depends on the length of the chain of carbons in the molecule. Different kinds of PFAS, some have 6 carbons, some have 8 carbons, behave differently in those sorts of treatment media. And that's why PFOA and PFOS, those have become, I think, fairly well understood for treatment methodologies. But some of these other shorter chain PFAS, which regulators are starting to look at, again, we have UCMR 5 coming out. There are 23 new PFAS compounds that will be scheduled for testing under that. And of course, that's usually the precursor to some sort of regulation. And many of those are shorter chain molecules that may call for a completely different treatment methodology. So yes, enormous challenge from the OEM perspective as well.
Yeah, and then just getting that into the hands of utilities. Utilities have to get that equipment as well, and then you run into capital problems, projects, timelines, all sorts of challenges on top of that too.
Right. That all takes money, and that is what my firm really does in this space is to try to um, get the manufacturers of the products that contain these compounds to pay for the expenses that the utilities face in cleaning them up. We're talking about even a treatment plant for a small wellhead treatment can easily run into the millions of dollars when we factor in capital expenditures and O&M. And of course, these are known as forever chemicals.
Mhm.
So you would expect your treatment facility for these to run for a very long period of time. A function of that as well is that these are still in some cases being introduced into the environment. We're not talking about a compound that was discontinued decades ago, as we often are with groundwater contaminants like pesticides, for example. We're talking about molecules and compounds that were still in wide use only about 5, 7 years ago in some cases.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, you alluded to it a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's on the horizon for the regulatory and legislative agenda. You alluded to the UCMR 5. We had a news item on Water and Waste Digest very recently about this and how it is open for public comment right now. What are your expectations in terms of that kind of a rule, and where do you think things will go from here?
So we pay very close attention to all of this, of course. My expectations are, again, given the level of public consciousness about these contaminants, that we will see, UCMR require testing of a wide number of these contaminants, as we've been talking about, just as has been proposed. And we'll continue to see a lot of regulatory action. One potential development that, of course, many utilities, both water and wastewater providers, are paying very close attention to is the potential for PFAS compounds or some number of PFAS compounds to be scheduled as toxic chemicals and therefore regulated under all of the federal statutes that restrict the disposal and create liability for the handling of toxic chemicals. And that puts a particular burden, if it happens, on wastewater plants, as we've already talked about, but even on drinking water providers, because of course, they can go through the process and come up with the funding for a wastewater treatment plant, but then, what do they do with their spent treatment media, for example, if that's a scheduled toxic substance? Who will they find to transport that, to dispose of it? It really could increase the costs significantly, and the costs are already pretty high. I will say that a lot of industry groups, AWA, for example, are very attuned to this, and have certainly been out there discussing the need for some sort of exception for PFAS in water and wastewater when it comes to its treatment as a toxic chemical. So there is some hope, but really what there is at this point is a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, yeah. And you touched on the disposal portion. I think that can be a whole interview all on itself because that's a whole nother animal as well, because you're talking about solids and all that kind of stuff too, and we've only talked about the water side today.
That's right. That's right. And the only way really to definitively destroy these PFAS compounds is through, at least that's been discovered that could be widely used so far, is through high temperature incineration. You know, that's what would break that very strong chlorine fluorine bond that, you know, makes these chemicals both so dangerous and so useful.
Yeah,
And there's just not the capacity for the high temperature incineration capacity in this country to handle all of the spent treatment media that would be required to clean up all of these contaminated water supplies. And that's just what we know about right now. You know, we've already
mhm,
talked about where the regulatory progress stands. And, you know, some states are really just getting started on this. There's been extensive testing in other states, but that is not the case in the majority of jurisdictions. And basically everywhere that they've looked for these chemicals, they've found them. I mean, a famous
mhm,
example that's given is in the blood of polar bears near the North Pole, in the blood of
mhm.
just about every human being on the face of the earth. So they're out there.
Yeah,
And the real vexing question is what to do about it and who's going to pay for it.
yeah, yeah. The one stat that I always go back to is from The Devil We Know, where they talked about doing this study to find people who didn't have it in their blood, and try as they might, they couldn't find it, and the only way to do it was to grab archived blood from before the Korean War. Unreal, totally unreal
Yeah. Yes.
statistic.
Yeah. And
So,
that speaks to, you know, both the prevalence and the longevity
mhm.
of these compounds in the environment.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Ken. I appreciate all the time that you took today and giving us some more insights into what you do and where things stand with PFAS at a federal, state, and even some local levels. So appreciate all the time that you had. For everyone who's watching, check our description below. We have a news item on the UCMR 5 that you can read, so you can learn some more information, and we'll have some resources from Ken's website as well, so that you can check those out too.